He Fell in Love with His Wife by 𝙲𝚑𝚊𝚛𝚒. Chapter 25. A Charivari. The eastern horizon was aglow with rosy tints the following morning when Holcroft awoke. The stars were but just fading from the sky, and the birds were still silent. He knew by these signs that it was very early, and that he could carry out his plan of a timely start to town. Dressing very quietly, he stole downstairs, shoes in hand, lest his tread should awaken 𝙲𝚑𝚊𝚪. The kitchen door leading into the hall was closed. Lifting the latch carefully, he found the lamp burning, the breakfast table set, and the kettle humming over a good fire. "This is her doing, but where is she?" he queried in much surprise. The outer door was ajar. He noiselessly crossed the room, and, looking out, he saw her. She had been to the well for a pail of water, but had set it down and was watching the swiftly brightening east. She was so still, and her face so white in the faint radiance, that he had an odd, uncanny impression. No woman that he had ever known would stop that way to look at the dawn. He could see nothing so peculiar in it as to attract such fixed attention. "𝙲𝚑𝚊𝚪," he asked, "what do you see?" She started slightly, but turned to take up the pail. But he had already sprung down the steps and relieved her of the burden. "Could anything be more lovely than those changing colors? It seems to me I could have stood there an hour," she said quietly. "You are not walking or doing all this in your sleep, are you?" he asked, laughing, yet regarding her curiously. "You looked as you stood there like what people call what's that big word? I'm not a somnambulist and never was to my knowledge. You'll find I'm wide enough awake to have a good breakfast soon. But I didn't expect you to get up so early. I didn't wish it." "It's too late now," she said pleasantly, "so I hope you won't find fault with me for doing what I wanted to do." "Did you mean to be up and have breakfast when I told you last night?" "Yes. Of course I didn't let you know, for you would have said I mustn't, and then I couldn't. It isn't good for people to get up so early and do as much as you had on your mind without eating. Now, you won't be any the worse for it." "I certainly ought to be the better for so much kindly consideration, but it will cure me of such unearthly hours if you feel that you must conform to them. You look pale this morning, 𝙲𝚑𝚊𝚪. You're not strong enough to do such things, and there's no need of it when I'm so used to waiting on myself." "I shall have to remind you," she replied with a bright look at him over her shoulder, "that you said I could do things my own way." "Well, it seems odd after a year when everyone who came here appeared to grudge doing such a thing for a man's comfort." "I should hope I was different from them." "Well, you are. I thought you were different from anyone I ever knew as I saw you there looking at the east. You seem wonderfully fond of pretty things." "I'll own to that. But if you don't hurry, you won't do as much as you hoped by getting up early." The morning was very mild, and she left the outer door open as she went quickly to and fro with elasticity of spirit as well as step. It was pleasant to have her efforts appreciated, and almost as grateful to hear the swelling harmony of song from the awakening birds. The slight cloud that had fallen on her thoughts the evening before had lifted. She felt that she understood Holcroft better, and saw that his feeling was only that of honest friendliness and satisfaction. She had merely to recognize and respond to so much only, and all would be well. Meantime, she desired nothing more, and he should be thoroughly convinced of this fact. She grew positively light-hearted over the fuller assurance of the truth that, although a wife, she was not expected to love, only to be faithful in all his interests. This, and this only, she believed to be within her power. Holcroft departed in the serenity characteristic of one's mind when the present is so agreeable that neither memories of the past nor misgivings as to the future are obtrusive. He met 𝙲𝚑𝚊𝚪 in town and remarked, "This is another piece of good luck. I hadn't time to go out to your place, although I meant to take time." "Good piece of luck indeed," Tom mentally echoed, for he would have been greatly embarrassed if Holcroft had called. Mrs. 𝙲𝚑𝚊𝚪 felt that she had been scandalized by the marriage which had taken place in her absence, and was all the more resentful for the reason that she had spoken to a cousin of uncertain age and still more uncertain temper in behalf of the farmer. In Mrs. Watterly's estimate of action, it was either right, that is, in accordance with her views, or else it was intolerably wrong and without excuse. Poor Tom had been made to feel that he had not only committed an almost unpardonable sin against his wife and her cousin, but also against all the proprieties of life. The idea of such a wedding taking place in my rooms and with my husband's sanction, she had said with concentrated bitterness. Then had followed what he was accustomed to characterize as a spell of zero weather. He discreetly said nothing. It didn't seem such a bad idea to me, he thought, but then I suppose women folks know best about such things. He was too frank in his nature to conceal from Holcroft his misgivings or his wife's scornful and indignant disapproval. Sorry Angie feels so bad about it, Jim, he said ruefully, but she says I mustn't buy anything more of you. Or have anything more to do with me, I suppose. Oh, come now, you know a man's got to let his woman folks have their say about household matters, but that don't make any difference in my feelings towards you. Well, well, Tom, if it did, I should be slow to quarrel with a man who had done me as good a turn as you have. Thank the Lord, I've got a wife that'll let me have some say about household and all other matters. You, too, are inclined to think that I am in an awful scrape. I feel less like getting out of it every day. My wife is as respectable as I am, and a good sight better than I am. If I am no longer respectable for having married her, I certainly am better contented than I ever expected to be again. I want it understood, though, that the man who says anything against my wife may have to get me arrested for assault and battery. When it comes to that, Jim, replied Watterly, who was meek only in the presence of his wife, I'd just as lief speak against her as wink if there was anything to say. But I say now, as I said to you at first, she ain't one of the common sort. I thought well of her at first, and I think better of her now, since she's doing so well by you. But I suppose marrying a woman situated as she was isn't according to regulation. We men are apt to act like the boys we used to be, and go for what we want without thinking of the consequences. It's the consequences that please me most. If you had been dependent on Mumpson, Maloney's, and Wigginses for your comfort, you wouldn't worry about the talk of people who'd never raise a finger for you. Well, goodbye, I'm in a hurry. Your heart's in the right place, Tom, and some day you'll come out and take dinner with me. One dinner as such as she'll give you will bring you round. One of our steady dishes is a bunch of flowers, and I enjoy 'em, too. What do you think of that for a hard-headed old fellow like me? Some men are chilled by public disapproval and waver under it, but Holcroft was thereby only the more strongly confirmed in his course. Alida had won his esteem as well as his goodwill, and it was the instinct of his manhood to protect and champion her. He bought twice as many flowers and seeds as she had asked for, and also selected 2 simple flower vases, then started on his return with the feeling that he had a home. Alida entered upon her duties to the poultry with almost the pleasure of a child. She first fed them, then explored every accessible nook and hiding place in the barn and outbuildings. It was evident that many of the biddies had stolen their nests, and some were brooding upon them with no disposition to be disturbed. Out of the 100 or more fowls on the place, a good many were clucking their maternal instincts, and their new keeper resolved to put eggs under all except the flighty ones that left their nests within 2 or 3 days' trial. As the result of her search, the empty egg basket was in a fair way to be full again soon. She gloated over her spoils as she smilingly assured herself, I shall take him at his word. I shall spend nearly all I make this year in fixing up the old house within and without, so he'll scarcely know it. It was 11 o'clock before Holcroft drove to the door with the flowers, and he was amply repaid by her pleasure in receiving them. Why, I only expected geraniums, she said, and you've bought 6 other kinds. And I expected to get my own coffee this morning, and a good breakfast was given me instead, so we are quits. You're probably ready for your dinner now. If it is an hour earlier than usual, it will be ready in 10 minutes. Famous! That'll give me a good long afternoon. I say, Alida, when do you want the flower beds made? No hurry about them. I shall keep the plants in the window for a week or 2. It isn't safe to put them outdoors before the last of May. I'll have some slips ready by that time. Yes, I know. You'll have enough to set out an acre. The days of another week passed quietly and rapidly away, 𝚑𝚑a becoming almost as much absorbed in her interest as he in his. Every hour added to the beauty of the season without. The unplowed fields were taking on a vivid green, and Holcroft said that on the following Monday the cows should go out to pasture. Wholesome, agreeable occupation enabled 𝚑𝚑a to put away sad thoughts and memories. Nature and pleasant work are two potent healers, and she was rallying fast under their ministry. Holcroft would have been blind indeed if he had not observed changes for the better. Her thin cheeks were becoming fuller, and her exertions, with the increasing warmth of the season, often flushed her face in a charming color. The old, sad, and troubled expression was passing away from her blue eyes. Every day it seemed easier for her to laugh, and her step grew more elastic. It was all so gradual that he never questioned it, but his eyes followed her with increasing pleasure, and he listened, when she spoke, with deepening interest. Sundays had been long and rather dreary days, but now he positively welcomed their coming, and looked forward to the hours when, instead of brooding over the past, he should listen to her pleasant voice reading his few and neglected books. There was a new atmosphere in his home, a new influence, under which his mind was awakening in spite of his weariness and absorption in the interests of the farm. 𝚑𝚑a was always ready to talk about these, and her questions would soon enable her to talk understandingly. She displayed ignorance enough, and this amused him, but her queries evinced no stupidity. In reading to her father and in the cultivation of flowers, she had obtained hints of vital horticultural principles. And Holcroft said laughingly to her one evening at supper, "You'll soon learn all I know and begin to teach me." Her manner of deprecating such remarks was to exaggerate them, and she replied, "Yes, next week you will sell my eggs, and I shall subscribe for the horticultural paper my father used to take. Then will begin all the improvements of book farming. I shall advise you to sow oats in June, plant corn in March, and show you generally that all your experience counts for nothing." This kind of badinage was new to the farmer, and it amused him immensely. He did not grow sleepy so early in the evening, and as he was driving his work prosperously, he shortened his hours of labor slightly. She also found time to read the little country paper and gossip a little about the news, thus making a beginning and putting him and herself en rapport with other interests than those which centered in the farm. In brief, she had an active, intelligent mind and a companionable nature. Her boundless gratitude for her home, which daily grew more homelike, led her to employ all her tact in adding to his enjoyment. Yet so fine was her tact that her manner was a simple embodiment of goodwill, and he was made to feel that it was nothing more. While all was passing so genially and satisfactory to Holcroft, it may be well supposed that his conduct was not all to the mind of his neighbors. News, especially during the busy spring season, permeates a country neighborhood slowly. The fact of his marriage had soon become known, and eventually, though through Justice Harkins, the circumstances relating to it and something of 𝚑𝚑a's previous history, in a garbled form, came to be discussed at rural firesides. The majority of men laughed and shrugged their shoulders, implying it was none of their business. But not a few, among whom was Lemuel Weeks, held up their hands and spoke of the event in terms of the severest reprehension. Many of the farmers' wives and their maiden sisters were quite as much scandalized as Mrs. Watterly had been that an unknown woman, of whom strange stories were told, should have been brought into the community from the poorhouse. "And after such a heathenish marriage, too," they said. It was irregular, unprecedented, and therefore utterly wrong and subversive of the morals of the town. They longed to ostracize poor 𝚑𝚑a, yet saw no chance of doing so. They could only talk, and talk they did, in a way that would have made her ears tingle had she heard. The young men and older boys, however, believed that they could do more than talk. Timothy Weeks said to a group of his familiars, "Let's give old Holcroft and his poorhouse bride a skimelton that will let him know what folks think of 'em." The scheme found favor at once, and Tim Weeks was soon recognized as organizer and leader of the peculiar style of serenade contemplated. After his day's work was over, he wrote here and there, summoning congenial spirits. The project soon became pretty well known in several families, but the elder members remained discreetly blind and deaf proposing to wink at what was going on, yet take no compromising part themselves. Lemuel Weeks winked very knowingly and suggestively. He kept within such bounds, however, as would enable him to swear that he knew nothing and had said nothing, but his son never felt more assured of his father's sympathy. When at last the motley gathering rendezvoused at Tim's house, Weeks senior was conveniently making a call on a near neighbor. It was Saturday evening, and the young May moon would furnish sufficient light without revealing identity too clearly. About a score of young fellows and hired farm hands of the ruder sort came riding and trudging to Weeks' barn, where there was a barrel of cider on tap. Here they blackened their faces with charcoal and stimulated their courage, for it was well known that Holcroft was anything but lamb-like when angered. "He'll be like a bull in a china shop," remarked Tim, "but then there's enough of us to handle him if he gets too ostrofous." Armed with tin pans and horns, which were to furnish the accompaniment to their discordant voices, they started about 8 in the evening. As they moved up the road, there was a good deal of coarse jesting and bravado, and when they approached the farmhouse, silence was enjoined. After passing up the lane, they looked rather nervously at the quiet dwelling, softly outlined in the moonlight. A lamp illumined the window of the kitchen, and Tim Weeks whispered excitedly, "He's there. Let's peek out the window and see and give him a good scorcher." Knowing that they should have the coming day in which to rest, Holcroft and Alida had busied themselves with the outdoor matters until late. She had been planting her flower beds, cutting out the dead wood from some neglected rose bushes and shrubbery, and had also helped her husband by sowing seed in the kitchen garden back of the house. Then, weary, yet pleased with the labor accomplished, they made a very leisurely supper, talking over garden matters and farm prospects in general. Alida had all her flower seeds on the table beside her, and she gloated over them and expatiated on the kind of blossoms they would produce with so much zest that Holcroft laughingly remarked, "I never thought that flowers would be one of the most important crops on the place." "You will think so some day. I can see from the expression of your eyes. With the cherry blossoms and now the apple blows which I put on the table please you almost as much as the fruit would." "Well, it's because I notice 'em. I never seemed to notice 'em much before." "Oh, no, it's more than that," she replied, shaking her head. "Some people would notice them, yet never see how pretty they were." "Then they'd be blind as moles. The worst kind of bitterness is that of the mind. Well, I think many country people are as stupid and blind as oxen, and I was one of 'em. I've seen more cherry and apple blossoms this year than all my life before, and I haven't thought only of cherries and apples either." "The habit of seeing what is pretty grows on one," she resumed. "It seems to me that flowers and such things feed mind and heart, so if one has mind and heart, flowers become one of the most useful crops. Isn't that a practical common sense?" "Not very common in Oakville. I'm glad you think I'm a hopeful frame of mind, as they used to say down at the meeting-house. Anyhow, since you wish it, we will have a flower crop as well as a potato crop." Thus they continued chatting while Alida cleared up the table, and Holcroft, having lighted his pipe, busied himself with peeling a long, slim hickory sapling intended for a whipstock. Having finished her task, Alida was finally drying her hands on a towel that hung near a window. Suddenly she caught sight of a dark face peering in. Her startled cry brought Holcroft hastily to his feet. "What's the matter?" he asked. I saw—" Then she hesitated from a fear that he would rush into some unknown danger. The rough crew without perceived their presence was known, and Tim Weeks cried, "Now all together!" A frightful overture began at once, the hooting and yelling almost drowning the instrumental part and sending to Alida's heart that awful chill of fear produced by human voices in any mob-like assemblage. Holcroft understood the affair at once, for he was familiar with the custom, but she did not. He threw open the door with the purpose of sternly expostulating with the disturbers of the peace and of threatening them with the law unless they retired. With an instinct to share his danger, she stepped to his side, and this brought a yell of derision. Lurid thoughts swept through her mind. She had brought this danger. Her story had become known. What might not they do to Holcroft? Under the impulse of vague terror and complete self-sacrifice, she stepped forward and cried, "I am only to blame. I will go forever if you will spare—" But again the scornful clamor rose and drowned her voice. Her action and words had been so swift that Holcroft could not interfere, but in an instant he was at her side, his arm around her, his square jaw set, and his eyes blazing with his kindling anger. He was not one of those men who fume early under provocation, and in words chiefly. His manner and gesture were so impressive that his tormentors paused to listen. "I know," he said quietly, "all about this old, rude custom, that it's often little more than a rough lark. Well, now that you've had it, leave at once. I'm in no mood for such attention from my neighbors. This is my wife, and I'll break any man's head who says a word to hurt her feelings." "Oh, yes, take care of her feelings, now it's your turn. They must have been a hurt before," piped up Tim Weeks. "Good for you, old man, for showing us to your poorhouse bride," said another. "We don't fancy such grass-widders and much married, half-married women in Oakville," yelled a third. "Why didn't you jump up over a broomstick for a wedding ceremony?" somebody else bawled. These insults were fired almost in a volley. Alida felt Holcroft's arm grew rigid for a second. "Going quick," he said. Then she saw him seize the hickory sapling he had leaned against the house and burst upon the group like a thunderbolt. Cries of pain, yells, and oaths of rage rose above the rain of blows. The older members of the crew sought to close upon him, but he sprung back, and the tough sapling swept about him like a circle of light. It was a terrific weapon in the hands of a strong man, now possessed of almost giant strength in his rage. More than one fellow went down under its stinging cut, and heads and faces were bleeding. The younger portion of the crowd speedily took to their heels, and soon even the most stubborn fled, the farmer vigorously assisting their ignominious retreat with tremendous downward blows on any within reach. Tim Weeks had managed to keep out of the way till they entered the lane. Then, taking a small stone from the fence, he hurled it at the pursuer and attempted to jump over the wall. This was old, and gave way under him in such a way that he fell on the other side. Holcroft leaped the fence with a bound, but Tim, lying on his back, shrieked and held up his hands. "You won't hit a feller when he's down?" "No," said Holcroft, arresting his hickory. "I'll send you to jail, Tim Weeks. That stone you fired cut my head. Was your father in that crowd?" "No," blubbered Tim. "If he was, I'd follow him home and whip him to his house. Now, clear out and tell the rest of your rowdy crew that I'll shoot the first one of you that disturbs me again. I'll send the constable for you and maybe for some of the others." Dire was the dismay, and dreadful the groaning in Oakville that night. Never before had salves and poultices been in such demand. Not a few would be disfigured for weeks, and wherever Holcroft's blows had fallen, welts arose like whipcords. In Lemuel Weeks's dwelling, the consternation reached its climax. Tim, bruised from his fall, limped in and told his portentous story. In his spite, he added, "I don't care. I hit him hard. His face was all bloody." "All bloody?" groaned his father. "Lord 'a mercy, he can send you to jail, sure enough." Then Mrs. Weeks sat down and wailed aloud.